Hello and welcome back to the Literary Theory PowerPoint that teaches you yet another level to help you analyze literature. This theory is going to focus on psychoanalytical criticism, which is basically the psychology at work, whether that's the psychology of the author or the characters. We will focus on the characters. A very simplified way to think of this is that the author's mommy-daddy issues affect their work. Again, very simple, but the main thing is we're going to delve into their psyches. We're going to delve into their psychological insecurities, fears, repressed desires, which help explain why the characters act the way they act. And this has been going on since ancient Greek literature. So for example, the play Oedipus Rex has a lot of fears about our parents' relationships to the extreme, okay? It's a very creepy tale once you break it down. At one point in the play, the main character, Oedipus, who's the king of Thebes, has this horrible dream that he slept with his mother. And his wife, Jocasta, says, no, don't worry. Many a man before you in his dreams has shared his mother's bed. And it seems like such an odd thing to say, but the fact that she's focusing on dreams really ties into psychology. Because the early psychoanalytical tenets really thought that dreams could shed light into someone's subconscious, the things that they are not fully aware of in the day-to-day. Oedipus Rex basically tells the story of this young prince from originally Corinth who gets this prophecy that he will kill his father and marry his mother. He's horrified, so he decides to run away to avoid that. But as you can imagine, because it's a Greek tale, by avoiding it, he actually made sure the prophecy came true, because it turned out he was adopted. So then when he ends up in this other city called Thebes, which the king had just been recently killed, he marries the queen, and then years later, he finds out that that queen was actually his mother, and that king who had died was actually his father. That man was killed by Oedipus himself as he was running away from Corinth. Obviously, he didn't know any of this, but the tale really became a fixture in Sigmund Freud's thinking that we really have to work through some of our parent issues to figure out what's going on with us psychologically. Again, Oedipus Rex is an extreme story of all of that, but it definitely was fundamental in how the early psychoanalytical scholars and clinicians thought about a person's psyche. So you heard me mention Sigmund Freud. You've probably heard his name mentioned before. He's basically the grandfather of psychology. Prior to that, people didn't really understand why some people suffered from neurosis or fears, or why they repress certain emotions. And he's really the first one to look at it seriously, even to look at dreams as serious, as containing some symbols to help us uncover what's going on in our subconscious. So his analysis of Oedipus was one of the first to provide insight into the human mind. So that's why I started with that story. And his main point is that our painful memories, especially from our childhood, become stored in our subconscious. We repress them because they're too difficult to deal with, but then they manifest themselves in our fears, in nervous tics we may have. So we have to decode those behaviors and look at the root that caused all those behaviors, and it tends to be childhood trauma, fears, repressed feelings. Freud and his believers, including Carl Jung, believe that great literature could provide insight into characters, right? So people write from their experiences, and these characters that they're writing probably reflect truths that most humans go through. So in Small Island, we're going to look at some passages that reflect what other people may have also experienced, especially when dealing with World War I and World War II. So key terms for psychoanalysis. The first one you've heard me mention several times already, repressed. So I definitely want you to use that as your vocabulary for analysis of some of these characters. Basically, desires, feelings, memories are controlled and remain locked in our subconscious. And although they manifest themselves, we are not outwardly aware of them. Oedipus complex, you just heard me say, which is the innate but repressed. It's not like we're aware of this at all. Desire to marry your mother and kill your father. From the female perspective, it's called the Electra complex. And I know even for me, it's like a sickening thought. How can this even be a subconscious thing at all? But if we simplify it a little bit, I think we can take some truths from it, which is basically that our parents' relationship definitely impacts the way we view marriage. And if we feel our parents had a successful relationship, if we admire the way our father respected our mother, for example, we may want to find a partner that does the same. Or if the opposite is true and we don't feel our parents had the healthiest relationship, we might do everything in our power to try to get away from it. But oftentimes people do repeat the same patterns, even when they're trying to avoid the very thing they thought was wrong, kind of like Oedipus himself trying to get away from the prophecy. Now, one of Sigmund Freud's followers, Lacan, didn't really think of the Oedipus complex too much. Instead, he came up with this term called the mirror stage. And if you have a younger sibling or cousins, you may have noticed this. Somewhere between the ages of 6 months old to 18 months, a baby realizes that the image in a mirror is not another playmate who does everything they're doing, but it's them. So it's that moment of identity of like, oh my God, that's me. And that's really pivotal in a child separating themselves from their parents. Because when a baby's first born, there's really no separation between that baby and the mother. Okay, they're seen as one unit, you know. But then as they get older, as they start to crawl, as they start to verbalize, and then they realize more about their environment, especially their identity in that environment, comes a sense of who they are. So the mirror stage is really important. I like to stress that because in literature, when a character looks at a body of water, when they look in the mirror, like Queenie has, that's important because it's often connected to identity. The Frankenstein, for example, the monster of Frankenstein, when he sees himself in a lake, he's horrified by what he sees. Because in his head, he's this intellectual being who's curious about the world around him, but his reflection is that of a monster, and it's really jarring to him. So just in general, look out for any reflective moments when a character is looking at themselves in a mirror, a lake, any kind of body of water that reflects back on them. You can analyze that psychologically. Okay, 3 of the main terms that Sigmund Freud came up with is that we have an id, an ego, and a superego. Our id is our pleasure principle. It seeks immediate gratification. Think of a baby. A baby is going to scream when they're hungry, when they've wet their diaper, when they want something. They don't care about their surroundings. Now, in an adult form, we tend to lock these up. Instead of expressing them, we lock them up. It's our innermost desires, our fears, insecurities, sometimes the dark truths a person hides from themselves. Like, I might want to portray that I'm a very calm, logical person, but in my innermost thoughts are actually much more aggressive and impulsive, and only when I'm very, very upset is that revealed. Okay? So the id is what we really, really desire, even if it may not be socially right to desire it, so we keep it locked up. The ego is the opposite. The ego is the reality principle. As the child starts to grow up, they understand they can't just scream whenever they want something or they're hungry. They need to ask please, they need to say thank you, and they need to wait for the right moments. And of course, as adults, we realize too that there is a time and a place for certain things. So think of this as your public persona. How I think of myself as part of a community and my role in it, and that obviously means that sometimes I might have to bite my tongue and be polite, even if I'm angry or upset or tired or whatever the case may be. Now, above that all is the superego. The superego is our conscience, our sense of right or wrong. We understand that it's right to do this or it's wrong to do this. Not because society is telling us this, not because of social pressures, not because it's the polite thing to do, but because intrinsically we know that this is the moral right thing to do. And this is something that we develop with age. Babies lack it, children sometimes lack it, and then through adolescence and onward, we develop more and more of a sense of right and wrong, of consciousness. So sometimes our id and our ego are fighting against each other. The hope is that our superego comes in to dictate how we should behave. But as we can tell in Small Island, oftentimes the characters don't do that, and we need to look at why that repressed emotion is showing itself. This is a really easy way to visualize it. Think of an iceberg. Our ego, we're aware of. We're aware of our manners and how we should behave and things like that. We're a little bit aware of our superego sometimes as well, our conscious, but a lot of our id is submerged. We're not aware of that. It's in our subconscious. So psychoanalysis, clinically speaking, was all about, okay, how can we peel back some of those repressed thoughts and work through them and see how we can manage them better or understand them better. So the main principles are the Oedipus complex. He took that from the ancient Greek play, and he also used it to analyze Hamlet. If you think of a modern setting, Back to the Future very much does that. If you haven't seen that movie from the 80s, in the first one, the kid goes from the 80s back to the 50s, and his mom falls in love with him. And by doing that, it messes up his own personal timeline, because then his parents may not actually end up together, so he has to right all those wrongs. So you can see the Oedipus complex there at play. Id, ego, superhero. Heroes or villains can be analyzed through their repressed desires and how they either control them or reveal them. And dreams. When a character dreams something, and there's a great passage with Bernard having a dream once he comes back home that there's a Japanese soldier entering his home and Queenie just says hello to him, that really shows his repressed fear, his PTSD, that the enemy's going into his house and Queenie's just going to invite them in instead of protecting their house. So let's look at some sample passages. I just mentioned Queenie, so I want to look back at something from her childhood. She's a teenager now in Lincolnshire, in the farm. Remember, her father's a butcher, and she's really upset about it all. She says, I should have been going to dances, larking with men who had Clark Gable hair and whispered in my ear that I was as pretty as an English rose. My legs should have been caressed in silk stockings, a pointed toe and a delicate heel on my shoe as I stepped from a car. I should have trailed Lily of the Valley scent, my hair waved, my face powdered to porcelain perfection. I should have been a lady, but I was stuck on a stinking farm. I want to focus on porcelain perfection. She has this image of what she wants to be. That's her id. That's her desire for what she wants. But why is that? What's repressed in her that's determining that that's her ideal? Notice the language where she repeats, I should have, 4 different times. That really stresses that. And the thing that it is, and the but, the transition in the end, but I was stuck on a stinking farm. Her repressed fear is that she's just a low-class farm girl. That she's never going to be worthy of her aunt's estimation of her. She's never going to fit into her proper name, Victoria. She's never going to be a proper wife. So her repressed feelings are that of inferiority, and she seeks something so much better. So that's why porcelain perfection really encapsulates that. And it could explain why she behaves the way she does. Because she's feeling inferior, she jumps at any chance to promote her status. Why she loves to go with Aunt Dorothy to London and stay with her and leave her family behind. When Aunt Dorothy dies, that's why she jumps at the chance to marry Bernard. She was going to break up with Bernard. They went to the park, Bernard was about to propose, and she was actually, maybe we shouldn't see each other anymore. And that was going to be the end of the relationship. But after her aunt dies and she realizes, I either go back to the farm or I marry this man that I'm not really interested in, she decides to marry the man she's not interested, which sounds horrible. But once you understand her repressed fear of just being a low-class farm girl, you can see why she wants to better her station instead. Similarly, Hortense. We don't think of Hortense and Queenie as being all that similar, but here she talks about her dream to be high class too. My dream was and always had been that I should find employment teaching at the Church of England school in Kingston, for it was there that light-skinned girls in pristine uniforms gathered to drink from the fountain of an English curriculum. But my interview for a position saw the headmaster of the school frowning. I evoked my father's cousins and told him Lovell Roberts, my father, a man of character, a man of intelligence, noble in a way that made him legend. The headmaster unwittingly shook his head as he asked me of my mother, my grandmother. His conclusion, although no word on the matter passed between us, was that my breeding was not legitimate enough for him to consider me worthy of standing in the elegant classrooms before their high-class girls. Just like Queenie said porcelain perfection, notice Hortense's language of light-skinned girls and pristine and high-class girls. This is the ideal she wants to aspire to. Why? What's the repressed feeling? She's illegitimate. And the headmaster, even though he doesn't say it, Hortense reads between the lines. I can't teach at this high-class school because I'm actually a bastard child. I'm not the legitimate child of Lovell Roberts. So she has to go teach at a low-class school too. So just like Queenie, Hortense's repressed id is about feeling inferior, about feeling illegitimate, and she'll do anything to be legitimate instead. So that's how we can use psychoanalytical key terms to analyze the characters in this novel. Thanks again.